Let's look at the source of the tension then. As ever, there are sort of claims and counterclaims within this, but broadly speaking, Palestinians blamed heavy-handed Israeli police force for what were initially essentially peaceful protests, and again, this always stems back to attempted evictions. But the Hamas response of firing rockets, this seemed to be the point of major escalation here.
I think if you put it into the context, Tom, the reality is what Palestinians saw in those expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah was a reliving of the trauma, our Nakba, our catastrophe of 73 years ago. Whilst boats were leaving Europe coming to what was supposed to be, what was becoming formed, a new state of Israel, those same ports were getting loaded with Palestinian refugees. I ended up in Australia because my father was forced out at the end of a bayonet. So when, in 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, on the bones of Palestine, those images that we saw in Sheikh Jarrah, they are the same images that we're reliving, our parents have relived, our children, for 73 years. Now, whilst that current flare-up, the current flare-up is in direct connection to Sheikh Jarrah, the trauma exists for 73 years. We can't take away the context. I mean, President Arafat went to the United Nations and made a speech in the early 70s. He said, "Today I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." Then we had Oslo in 93. That's 28 years ago. The Palestinians were supposed to have a state 5 years after that. You can't keep denying a people their rights to self-determination and Indigenous peoples' connection to their land. Cage them up, as we've done in Gaza, 2 million people in a bit of dirt that's 365 square kilometres. I mean, it's the size of Ballarat, Tom. At some point, justice has to prevail. And until such time, I mean, I don't know, we're going to get continuation of the sort of barbarity that we're seeing on your screens now.
So, but just in terms of what we've seen as the escalation at the balance, because you said in response to my initial question, it just has to stop, no conditions. But did it all escalate because of those first Hamas rockets?
Well, I think it escalated because Israel, post the Trump era, with the recognition of all of Israel, all of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Netanyahu's emboldened, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's come through 4 elections without actually a decisive mandate. He's endeavoured to, we believe, manufacture a political crisis that allows him to have the sort of press conference that he's just had. And to that extent, the reality is all of Benjamin Netanyahu's challenges have all fallen by the wayside, fallen in behind him. He's a wartime Prime Minister. He's back in charge again. So, I mean, I think it just creates a change in timeline. I don't think we can say that this is because of Hamas. This is because of the ongoing campaign of Israel, of the Jewish state, to de-Palestinize what was historic Palestine. It's an ongoing Nakba, an ongoing catastrophe.
What is your view of Hamas?
Personally, I mean, look, they're a Palestinian resistance movement. I'm no great fan, and I certainly don't think that it strategically works very well. But the cold hard fact is, I'd rather, if you do it in brute binary, a missile, and we saw the picture of the synagogue there, whilst it creates some terror, it's a little hole. A missile or an F-35 aeroplane, Apache helicopters. Israel's a nuclear-armed state. You know, there is no parity when you talk about a conflict. I'm no fan of Hamas, but I really, really don't like Israel and its heavy-handed military operations. And the way they just talk to, honestly, just flagrantly. I mean, they bombed the Associated Press building. They said that Hamas is there. Amnesty International did a comprehensive report the last time Israel was doing this and said there was no evidence that Hamas had been in the sort of places that Israel said that they were. They make these comments, put it out there, it gets circulated by the media, and we don't see anything.
They're being pressed on evidence for that, so that will be something I'm sure will at least continue to be asked in the coming days. But just finally on this, you mentioned that you're no fan of Hamas. Do you think it's true that while they seem to be involved in any sort of negotiation, that's unlikely to resolve in some sort of peace? Hamas does not want Israel to exist.
Tom, we've had 28 years since Palestine was supposed to exist. Yeah? Israel doesn't want Palestine to exist. Tom, I spent the entire weekend with family
That's not the
members
official
creating
policy,
phone
though, of
banks.
the Israeli government.
It's the official policy of the Likud party, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's party. It's official party of the Likud party, which says there will be no Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. That's Benjamin Netanyahu. But let me get back to the phone banks. My family, my friends and I, we're desperately WhatsApping, calling, Skyping, trying to find out if our relatives and friends are alive and creating WhatsApp groups. That's what I spent my entire weekend doing. And I'm not alone. There are many other Australians of Palestinian ancestry that are trying to deal with the trauma that Israel's inflicting. I mean, they're bombing entire buildings, Tom. At some point, it's beyond Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu. What we're talking about here is 73 years of denied self-determination. At some point, the Palestinians need to have a country. Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Israel's own, a Jewish NGO, said there's an apartheid regime within Israel and the way it treats Palestinians. Now, boycotts worked in South Africa. It's time for us to start boycotting the state of Israel. We need to sanction it, hold it to account. In the very first instance, we need to stop the killing, Tom. We've got to stop the killing straight away.
Everyone would agree with that last sentiment. Nasser, Mashni, we agree. Thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, mate.